Well, good morning, everybody. It's 8:15, so we're going to go ahead and start our session this morning. Today's session is Public Service Ethics and Open Government, subject near and dear to all of our hearts, and incredibly topical these days, I find. Every time I turn on the television, it's another ethical question out there. So we're really happy to have Bill Sims up here, an expert at that, and a man who has a huge amount of experience with government and ethics for sure. So we should all enjoy today's session. Before we get started, my name's Doug Von Gossig. I'm the mayor of Clarkdale, and we run a very ethical town in Clarkdale. Really take it seriously, and I appreciate you all coming out to learn a little bit more about it, because I think when we're running good ethical governments, we're running good governance. And the people can trust what you're doing in your town, and it leads to just a lot of good growth and wonderful things for your community. We're going to have handouts on the back table, right back there in the very back. So those handouts will have pointers to this session and to other materials that you'll be hearing about in this session. So drop by after the session or now if you want to, and grab one of those things. All of this will be on the League's website tonight, or by tonight probably. And those pointers are on the materials in the back there too. Please either silence or turn off your cell phones. I say that, and I know mine will go off at some point in my pocket, having not done that. And we're going to be talking about ethics in government. Our speaker is Bill Sims. Bill focuses his practice in representing for-profit and non-profit corporations, cities, towns, counties, and school districts. I think he's represented almost every town in Arizona at one point or another. He's involved in negotiating and documenting development projects and other complex transactions involving the financing, construction, and operation of public facilities. Bill graduated summa cum laude from the University of Arizona, which we're not going to hold against him today. Yeah? Other attorneys can't posit in this at all. His Juris Doctorate degree, and was a member of the Arizona Law Review, a Rhodes Scholar. Bill obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees from Oxford University, as well as earning a bachelor's degree at the U.S. Air Force Academy, which I will absolutely join you in, so congratulations on that. So please welcome Bill Sims.
Thank you, Mayor. Before I stepped up, the mayor said to me, this is really coming at an opportune time as we witness what's going on at levels of government above us. The theme for today's conversation is we're going to talk about our founding fathers. I'm going to quote from a biography about Thomas Jefferson and one about John Adams. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that our founding fathers had a unique view of our country. They had a broad vision of how our country would work. They had ideals that they expected our country to follow. And at the end of the session, I hope you're going to see that you are our last best hope. I mean, you are the level of government that can work. You are the level of government that can't get, hopefully will not get infected with the problems that have resided at other levels of government. Here are two quotes, and these are right from the biography. And you're going to find out, how many mayors do we have here? I know we have one. Do we have any others? You're going to find out Adams and Jefferson have comments dating 250 years ago that you could have as a mayor. As they began putting together the documents that govern our country, they predicted the kinds of issues you would confront. And the theme for today's session is that we staff and the laws are not here to impede, although when we talk about the open meeting law, I bet some of you will be a little disgruntled, but we're here to help you carry out your vision. But let's first start with some quotes. John Adams: "The people of America now had the best opportunity and the greatest trust in their hands that Providence ever ordained to a small number since Adam and Eve." That's in the book, and it's really a good read. Jefferson: "I venture to assert that there is not upon the face of the earth a body of people more happy or rising into consequence with more rapid stride than inhabitants of the United States of America. Population is increasing, new houses building, new lands clearing, new settlements forming, and new manufacturers establishing with a rapidity beyond conception." Now, they could say that because our country was formed at a unique time. We were protected by two oceans. We didn't have hostile neighbors Canada and Mexico. We are a country, although we have "in God we trust" on our currency, we are a country that has clear separation of state. And when you look at some of the new states nations that are trying to emerge, they get infected with the problems with religion imposing their will, like ISIS. We're really fortunate that our founding fathers were able to chart a path that did separate church and state. And I say founding fathers. When you read the book, you're going to see that Abigail played as much a role in helping John Adams form his views as he did. And as I travel around the state, and I'm the town attorney or city attorney for 7, I'm seeing more and more women serving on councils. And you're seeing that in the national election as more and more women are running. No offense to the guys in the room, but sometimes women have an approach that's more susceptible to finding a solution because they don't always put their ego out front. But anyway, Abigail, when I say founding fathers, Abigail plays a role. But the founding fathers aren't the only ones who guide our efforts. These are quotes from two of the best presidents of the 20th century, I think the third being FDR. John F. Kennedy. "We must always consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all upon us." Reagan. "America is a shining city upon a hill whose beacon light guides freedom-loving people everywhere." That came from two presidents from two different parties, almost with an identical view. And it's that beacon of light. It's the beacon of light that when you a mayor gavel a meeting to order, you and your council are illuminating for your community a light to hopefully explain to them your vision, to explain to them the way ahead, and to hopefully garner their support. To do that, we're going to talk about the pillars of government that allow you to do what you need to do. How many non-elected officials do we have here? And see, we play a role. You guide us and we implement. We're not elected. Although some city attorneys and town attorneys think they are, but we're not. And we're here to help you. And you have these 4 pillars to help you chart your path. And the first one is open government. Again, we're going to quote a quote from a founding father. Well, before saying that, there are 2 aspects of open government here in Arizona: the open meeting laws and the public records law. This is Madison, a Virginian. "A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." The open meeting law is meant it holds you accountable, to give you an opportunity to inspire trust, and to garner support, so that you could explain to your public why it is you want to do what to do. And we're going to go through quickly. And there is a statute that says before you were elected, you needed to have this briefing. So if you didn't, look now and we'll fake it. This is the purpose of the open meeting law. It is the public policy of this state that meetings of public bodies be conducted openly and that notices and agendas contain such information as is reasonably necessary to inform the public. Why? Again, we want the public to know what you're going to do, so that if you're going to do something on the agenda, they can come and attend and listen. Who does it apply to? It's very broad. All boards and commissions of your city or town, all multi-member governing bodies, or this wouldn't be you, institutions and instrumentalities. So if you create an entity that you control, that entity then becomes subject to the open meeting law, and it includes committees. You may ask, and sometimes your city attorney is going to say to you when you form a committee, if you form a committee that comes back with a recommendation to you, even if it's less than a quorum of your council, that's a public body, and the committee has to comply with the open meeting law. There's some differences in what notices and what minutes it has to keep, but it still has to have the proper notices. There are exceptions. Again, the goal here is to explain to you and hopefully convince you that the law isn't an absolute impediment. It would be impossible to run government if the press and the public could sit in on staff meetings, and so the open meeting law does not apply to staff meetings. It does not apply to staff-appointed committees that advise your city or town manager. And there's what's called the department head exception. It does not apply to a body that is run by an executive. That executive could be the mayor, but as long as that body doesn't make recommendations back to the council. For example, when we did the Bank One ballpark almost 25 years ago, Maricopa County Board of Supervisors 5 appointed a committee because this was very important. That tax was not voter approved, and so the Board of Supervisors had to make sure they had reasonable control. And so they put 2 supervisors, less than a quorum, on this body because this body was going to make a recommendation to the eventually to the council or to the board, and they advised the county manager that they were called now. I think they're now called county administrative officers. So the open meeting law doesn't apply to a group that doesn't make a recommendation to the council and only makes a recommendation to the manager. And I do, for those who know me, and some of my clients are here, they appreciate that I do talk fast because it reduces their bill. But if you've got a question, raise your hand and don't be ashamed or afraid. That'll get us going, because once the person asks the first one, then more will ask. Okay. What is a meeting? The gathering in person or through technological devices, phones, internet, of a quorum of you to discuss, propose, or take legal action, including any deliberations by a quorum. So if you're a 5-member council and 3 of you are at a restaurant talking about an item on the agenda coming up next week, that's an open meeting law violation. And there was a new open meeting law adopted. I bet your clerks are aware of it. They make clear what was in the law in the past, but it's crystal clear now. One-way electronic communications by 1 member sent to a quorum, just simply saying, I think this should be on the agenda, would be a violation. That's why how many managers do we have? I bet we have a few. That's why your managers are so important. I think you go to your manager, and the manager and the clerk then can put out an agenda that includes the recommendation. But this new law makes it crystal clear that if you send a one-way communication just saying this should be on the agenda, or even send it to the manager and copy the other 5 or 4, that'd be a violation. What is legal action? A collective decision, commitment, or promise made by you. So it'd be any time a majority of a quorum. So let's assume 3 of you are at the bar and it's a 5-member quorum, and after your second beer, 2 of you decide to do something. That's action. It's illegal because it wasn't noticed, and we're going to talk about the penalties in a little bit, and that new law really increased the penalties. Oops. Notice. You have to give notice. But there is an acknowledgement of emergencies, and we have some council members from Camp Verde. It requires an actual emergency. I can remember years ago, and when town and city attorneys give this, they say it needs to be a real emergency, like a flood or a fire. We had a flood in the Verde, and so we held an emergency session. And so, but again, the purpose of the open meeting law, following Madison's suggestion, is to make sure government is open, is then you as quickly as possible put out a notice. And what we did there is like we put it on the web, and then we rapidly put a notice out as to what occurred. And that notice has to be within 24 hours, and it can include Saturdays but not Sundays. What do you do if you're at a meeting, it's been properly agendized, it's been noticed? Can you recess? Yes. But prior to the recess, you must announce the time and place where you're going to resume. Why? Again, the theory is to tell the public what you're going to do. You've already noticed the meeting, so they're there, or they're watching on TV, and then you say, we were going to reconvene this tomorrow at this time at this location. And the open meeting law says you can actually say, please look on our website for the notice. I think that works when you're just re-noticing an open meeting law, an agenda item that's subject to the open meeting law. I don't think that works if you're now recessing an action that's subject to a public hearing like a rezoning. There's other provisions of Title IX that require some very specific hard notices, published notices in the paper, notices on the bulletin boards and on the site. I think if you're going to recess an action like a planning and zoning decision, I think you shouldn't rely on, please look at the website. I think you've got to specifically say in the meeting, we are reconvening this hearing, and call it a hearing, to be reconvened at this location at this time. If you don't do that, you got to start over with the publications in the paper and the publications on site and the publications on the bulletin board. I thought I almost had a question. I was hopeful, but we'll get there. I'll get you to ask a question. Attending by phone. Yes, you can attend by phone if you can't reach a quorum. And some have said, I don't know that it has to be, the question is, can you do it as a matter of convenience? I think you can. I don't think it has to be an emergency. And so if a council member is on vacation, I think it's perfectly fine to participate in phone. There needs to be a speaker so that the people attending the hearing, the meeting, can hear everyone that's speaking from the phone. And the AG requires that you actually must put on the agenda that participation on the agenda for the meeting, that people might be participating by phone. That's why it's wise for every agenda to include it, because you don't know if someone might need it. Again, we said this is the first pillar, open government. We want the public to know, but then it's kind of insane. There's sometimes you need private discussion. I can remember I was in one jurisdiction explaining the importance of the executive session, and this jurisdiction, a member of the public said, well, wait a minute, we need to be an open government, and everything has to be done in public. And I said, well, no. Later on, when we talk about efficient government and how you're spending public money to do projects, if you were a corporation spending millions of dollars of money, your shareholders would want you to get legal advice in private. That's what this is. This is limited exceptions that allow you to do things that are appropriately held in public and private. But again, we have to have a notice. You have to tell the public what it is you're going to, just generally what it is you're going to do, and cite the statute. You just can't cite the statute. You got to say we're going to do it to this statute and to get legal advice on this. But you can't defeat the purpose. I mean, let's assume the police chief is aware of improprieties in one of the departments and where a department head is stealing from the city or town. And let's assume it's so important that the manager believes, because normally that would come up to the manager and the manager could probably decide, although in some very few instances the police chief works for the council and then it would have to come to the council. And you want to tell the council. Well, you wouldn't want to say in the agenda, oh, by the way, we're going to get advice on 3 employees who are stealing from the Public Works Department. I think you just say, concerning an investigation regarding activities on town staff. And you shouldn't have to compromise the attorney-client privilege. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Sign-in sheets aren't required. Persons addressing the body, though, have to identify their name. And that's why you usually make them, on the speaker slip, to write their name and address. After hours, don't lock the entrance doors because it's supposed to be an open meeting. And you have to record, the clerks know this, record the motions and the maker of the motions. This is new. The new law says you must record how each member voted. That means everything. And in the past, people have just said yay or nay. And so clerks have said, what do you do? Yes, sir.
Does that include adjournment as well?
No, I got that. That was a good question. I'm going to answer that now. I think for actions that are just unanimous, as long as it's unanimous, I think the clerk can say the action was unanimous, and that would record how everyone voted. If not unanimous, I can't think of. I've never seen it before. Maybe you have, where one says, I don't want to adjourn. So yeah, if someone said I don't want to adjourn, then the clerk would have to say, yep, so and so didn't want to adjourn, and they spent the night. But no, that's a new one, and that's a new one, and so it is. So I think you mayors, I think you call the vote. If it's clearly unanimous by the yeas and nays, then the clerk can say unanimous. If there's a nay, then you got to vote by person. Pitfalls, and this happens a lot. Passing notes between councilors. Remember, the open meeting law says those folks that are watching on TV or in the chairs watching you want to know what you're saying. So you can't be passing notes to each other. Same comment, whispering to fellow council members. You're not supposed to do that. And oftentimes you do if it's clearly and everyone can hear, hey, I have to go to the bathroom or something and I need to leave. I mean, that I think is fine. You have to have some reason. But if you're truly having a systemic practice of having your council have these bilateral communications privately, that violates the open meeting law. And this is a biggie, and this happens a lot. Quorum talking before the meeting or after the meeting about subject matter pertaining to the public body. That's a violation. And so what you try to do is when I'm there, I look around, and usually it's not a quorum, but if it is a quorum, hopefully it's just things like a social activity that doesn't involve the public's business or the city's business or town's business. Public's right. They have the right to attend, listen, and tape record or videotape. Anybody here from Quartzsite? Ken and I went to Quartzsite years ago, and I felt like I was a movie star. I walked in and everybody had video cameras. I mean, everybody in the audience. The whole thing was being filmed by everybody, and they have that right. The public right doesn't, the public technically has no right to speak or disrupt. And that really falls to you mayors. That's one of your, mayors have we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have an awesome responsibility with not a lot of power. But one of your key powers are how you agendize meetings, what you agendize, and how you hold the meeting. Calls to the public, not required, but if you have them, there are 3 responses. You can respond to criticism, you can ask staff to review the matter, or ask that it be placed on an agenda. There is a problem in that if you can't allow a follow-on conversation. I think that's here. Yeah. No, in a minute we'll talk about that. You can limit time. I mean, I think it's typical to limit time. I can remember back to the ballpark in '95. Again, the ballpark chase, or back when Bank One, it wasn't a public vote, and as a result, we had one supervisor shot and 2 unelected. For those of you who didn't know that, running for office in Arizona can be challenging. But they're the chair of the board, let everyone speak unlimitedly, and we were there all night. We were in downtown Phoenix. We were there all night because he knew that the public had not had a chance to vote, and this vote was going to be the decision to tax the citizens of Maricopa County. And he let everybody speak. You can set ground rules for civility, language, and treat everybody the same. And when we talk about ground rules, let me just give you a couple. I know all of you. I bet all of you. I'm assuming most jurisdictions have in your code that you follow Robert's rules. That can be a benefit, and it can be a problem. This is Robert's rules. It's like 400 pages of small print. This is a document that you can get through the league. It's the thumbnail sketch. Robert's rules should be used as a shield to promote conversation, not as a sword to prevent conversation. If you're a mayor and you have 2 counselors arguing about Rule 503B and whether or not it requires a second agenda off the table or whatever, we haven't really gone in the right direction. They have the right under your code, but I would suggest use this document. It really is a simple document that sort of guides what you can do under Robert's rules. Uh-oh, I lost the clicker. Oh, there it is. We end this right now. The open meeting law requires you to describe current events. You, the members, and the mayor all can talk about current events. It needs to be on the agenda. But you can't propose, discuss, or deliberate. That was what I was going to talk about a minute ago. I was at a council meeting last week, and there was a counselor proposed something, and there was a question by one of the other counselors as to what it meant. And the question was asked, and the mayor said to me, is this okay? And what he was saying was, the current event summary can't be used to circumvent having a public discussion on something that wasn't on the agenda. And again, you have to use reasonableness here. And I said, yeah, I think it's okay to answer the question, but we shouldn't then have follow-on dialogue. That's the last point. Executive sessions have to be limited to it's a limited exception. You must state the specific provision of law and a general description. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's 7 of them. You have them in the materials. I'm going to go to 3 of them. The first one, they're the ones you're going to use the most. The first one is personnel. You're generally going to do that because generally the manager works for you, the attorney works for you. For some of you, the clerk works for you. The magistrate doesn't necessarily work for you, but is responsible to you in a direct way. For those, I think will all, when you decide to hire and fire or review, you're allowed to do that under one, and you do it a lot. And that your clerk will tell you have to give the employee a 24-hour written notice that you're going to do it, so that if the employee wishes to, they can have the meeting in public. Number 3 is the general one that's going to be on all your agendas. It says you can get legal advice. But that legal advice is to get one-way communication from your attorney to get direction to you as to what you're doing and how it is impacted by the statutes or your ordinances. Number 4 is the most likely one that you will see for almost every agenda item. And that's both relative to litigation and for contracts under negotiation. And under 4, then the lawyer can give you advice, you can come back to the lawyer and she can get that advice, and then go have negotiations. There was a case on this. I didn't know it, but I was actually in it. I was a partner. I had just made partner I'd been in the Air Force active duty and reserve about 15 years, and I was late coming to law. And my wife, we'd finally bought a house, and I finally had a salary that was just over into six figures, and she was pleased. And Rick Romley and Jim Bruner asked me to give that up and to help them do the Bank One ballpark deal. And much to my wife's chagrin, I took them up on it and took a 50% pay cut. But in the E-session where they discussed hiring me, they were probably laughing at how much I was going to get paid. I don't know. But they actually talked about policy, and the Bank One ballpark back at the time was the subject of much scrutiny by the New Times, and so they wanted to see what was being said in E-session, and it was policy. And so the law was clarified that you can't discuss policy. You can have direct conversations with your lawyer. In fact, you can't even have conversations with your lawyer back and forth if you don't give them number 4. Number 4, you can say, well, lawyer, if we do this in the contract, what does that mean the developer will do? You can get that advice. But that's why you need 4. The only other one, 7, if you have a real estate deal, particularly if you have outside attorneys like me who are getting paid by the hour, they don't have to be in this one. You can give your manager all the direction you need when doing real estate deals. The lawyer doesn't have to be in there for number 7. The lawyer only needs to be in there for number 3 and number 4. Legal advice, this is what I was talking about, policy. It must be the lawyer for you. Again, back when I was a county attorney, we had discussions with state parks. And there were some citizens who were concerned about what we were doing, and we had a joint E-session with the state parks AG and me, and from the county, and another arm of the AG. Back then it was called the Open Meeting Law Enforcement Task Force, omelet lovingly. They got wind of it, and they told us that was wrong, because we had 2 lawyers from 2 different bodies. And so generally, it needs to be the lawyer for the body, with one exception. I think if you're in litigation and you're joint defendants and you have what we call as a common defense agreement, or a joint defense agreement, I think there you could have the lawyers for both. But it needs to be very carefully documented. And I'm doing my best to get you guys to ask questions, and you won't get there. Maybe I'll say something really stupid in your last question. Okay, what is allowed? You have advice regarding legal ramifications. And is what we're doing legal? What is not allowed, I mentioned this earlier, what's not allowed to use the E-session to mask policy direction. And it's a close call back there when you're evaluating the manager. I think the open meeting law allows you to set guidelines for the manager, to set evaluation criteria, I think, in E-session. But if that lapses into discussing the broader policy goals for a jurisdiction, that would go beyond that scope of that number 1, personnel. If you hold a meeting in violation, that meeting of the 3 guys drinking a beer and 2 making a decision in the bar, everything they did will be null and void, thankfully. And there can be some penalties. Filing an action in court, there can be a contempt of court, there can be an injunction ordering you to stop, and this is a new law. In the past, the penalty was $500. It's now up to $2,500 if there's been like multiple violations. So, and I'm hopeful that your clerks or your city and town attorneys have told you. But don't overreact. I was talking to the mayor of Clarkdale about before the current administration in Camp Verde. There was a time in Camp Verde where it was very polarized. And I can remember many times I have heard counselors use the excuse of the open meeting law as to why they won't talk to their colleagues. Oh, I don't want to create a violation. That's wrong. You should reach out to those you disagree with the most. And you shouldn't say, I can't talk to so-and-so because of the open meeting law. I think if our government's going to work, and now we're still in the first of 4, and you're going to say, when is Sim's going to quit? We have 3 more, but the 3 are shorter. You need to reach out and have discussions. And don't hide back. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Just came up about the new law. The word discussions is in there.
Uh-huh.
And talked to our clerk about it. If 2 of our council members talk about one of the subjects that's going to be on the agenda, and then another 2 talk about the same thing, and another 2 talk about the same thing, then we've got all the council members talking about that to different people. Is that in violation?
You're very lucky if it's not, because what you just said, I'm assuming you're a 7-member council, and what you just said is 2, 2, and 2. If none of the 2s talk, if there's no tie between the 2s, that would be okay. But I bet you that's not the case. But I mean, you're right. If you have 3 sets of 2, with none of the 2 melding, you'd be okay. Thank you for asking the first question. Public Records Act, this is quick. The open meeting law is the most important. Again, on that Madison slide, I said there are 2 big aspects of the state law that requires your government to be open, public records being one. And there's a new AG opinion that is questionable. First of all, not all emails are public records. This was a case out of Pinal County, the county manager, and the press wanted access to his records, and the court held that to-do lists from your wife, where you're going to go on vacation, something that's clearly not within the scope of your public service is not a public record. And the town attorneys and city attorneys, we've always taken that to mean that even if you're on your home computer, that if you're doing the public's work and recording documents, that it's probably public. But the AG came out with an opinion last year that reached a contrary view, which I frankly don't agree with. So get with your town and city attorney. For those of you who want to use your private computers, that gives you a safe harbor to say that the AG says it's not public. But think about it. If you're doing all your work off your home computer and your constituents want to know what you're doing and you're saying, sorry, it's my home computer, I think that's a losing argument, but the AG may disagree with me. And websites are the same thing. Yes, ma'am.
Using your home computer, but using the city's webmail, not your personal.
Oh, that would be there. You're, once you get into the webmail, you're there. I mean, yeah. Yeah, you're there because the webmail is, the AG would agree with that. Because once you get to the webmail, it's a public thing. It's there. It's now on the public server, so it's public then.
But just because I'm at home using my personal computer, but using webmail.
Would be public.
Webmail.
That would be clearly public, even in the eyes of our AG.
Right.
But let's assume it's Hotmail. The AG's opinion says no, and I don't know that that's valid. Because when you read that Griffith's opinion, it's out of Pinal County. He was the manager. We're going to talk about improper use of public funds later. That was one of his problems. But our courts said the private notes were not part of his job, therefore not public. We've all taken that to mean if he did it at his home computer, it is public, it would be, but there is an AG opinion that's contrary. Websites, the same thing. I know many mayors have, but many council members have blogs, and clerks hate it, because if they truly are creating public records, it creates a massive amount of public records. And so here are the AG's opinions actually helpful. But I truly think if you're a mayor gathering information to bring to the council on items from your constituents, I think it comes close to creating a document that's in your official capacity. But the AG opinion is contrary. Okay, that was only one of 4. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, so I'm a clerk.
Yeah, well, good.
And, my question is, I'm doing a public records request, and they've asked for all emails to a new council member. So we're going through and we're doing it on our server. But then if you see that a council member is sending emails from their city account to their personal account, and the public comes back with a second public records request and asks for access to the council member's personal account to see where that chain went, can you deny that public record?
See, well, if you're the AG, maybe. But where I would say no is because you started this by saying the trail went from government to private, and I suspect that email chain will include the government email. So I would argue it is public. But I think this is what town or city are you from? Oh, yeah, I know your city, Cliff. I know Cliff very well. And get with him. My view is I truly think that if the elected official is using her home email or home email address to do the public's business, I think it's a public record. But you know what? I think to defend the counselor is to say, this is the private. Well, right now you read that AG opinion. Everything on your public phone. Everything is public, and say, you've asked about information on a private device. In light of the AG's opinion, we have to be careful about invading the privacy of individuals. So we're going to have to look at it more closely, and that would give you time to respond. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
When you have a litigation that's been settled with a business in your community, and they come back, that business comes back and makes requests, and we've got an attorney's opinion from the pool, avoid that they should have already received everything they were asking for. What takes precedence? The public documents or advice from an attorney from the pool?
That was good. Your clerk has actually asked me about that. The mayor asked two questions. One, there's been litigation. It's created records. And the other party to the litigation has come now with a public records request after the litigation is terminated. The defending attorney, the risk pool's attorney who represents the city, has said during the course of the litigation, hell no, you don't give anything. But in this case, the reason we declined that request is not because your defense counsel said no, it's because they already had it. And so that's perfectly fine. You do not need, that is a problem with our public records law, and I think if anything, in talking to your lobbyists, to try to get some protection about the burdensome public records request. But what I always say is I hide behind the words burden, and I'd say you already have that information, we don't need to get, and that's exactly what I told your clerk. Okay. Hi, Glenn.
Here's an example of what unethical is.
Glenn Gibbett, he's been an attorney in a number of cities in town. Okay, now we're in the second pillar. We'll go a little quicker. The first pillar was everything's going to be in the open. The second pillar is going to be, now that you're acting in the open, we want you to act for the purposes of the public and not your self-purpose. No self-dealings, no conflicts of interest, no extra compensation, no inappropriate gifts, no discrimination, and no retaliation against whistleblowers. First of all, conflicts of interest are okay. If we truly had government comprised of councils with persons who have no contacts with anybody in your community, they're all just nerds at home on their computers, so they don't have conflicts, we've got a problem. Some of the best counselors can be developers. Why? Because they know what development means. So they can be on your council, and if something comes up that deals with one of their developments, she can just say to you, I'll recuse myself. And that's what this says. They would identify the conflict, they would disclose the conflict, and disqualify themselves. Identify it. Any public officer or employee who has or whose relative has a substantial interest, as italicized because it's defined, we'll get to that later, in any decision shall make known such interest in the official records and shall refrain from participating in any manner in that discussion, not just decision, but discussion. Who is subject? All of you, your employees. It includes spouse, child, grandchild, parent, grandparent, siblings, and in-laws. Remember a minute ago we had substantial interest italicized? What that means is if something comes before your council and it doesn't fall within one of these definitions of remote interest, it becomes substantial, and you've got to disclose. What are they? A non-salaried officer of a nonprofit corporation. You're the deputy director of the St. Vincent de Paul, and St. Vincent de Paul has a memorandum of understanding with you concerning use of town facilities to collect goods. Perfectly fine. A landlord or tenant of a contracting party. In the 7 jurisdictions where I work, you won't see many high-rises, but listen, in Phoenix, if you're a counselor and you're a tenant in one of the high-rises that is subject to a development agreement entered into by the city, that's not a conflict. This one I don't like. It's if you're the attorney of a contracting party, you can vote on it. What that means is your client could be there and you'd be here, and it ain't a conflict. I think it is, and I would disclose it. I would disqualify myself.
Bill, there also might have to be an ethics problem for all the reasons why.
So Glenn will chip in. I've known him for many, many years. He's currently the deputy down in San Luis. You're a member of a nonprofit corporate association. You're a businessman or woman, and you are on council. And the business is a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And Chamber of Commerce has that perpetual agreement that we're going to talk about when we talk about challenges to Chamber of Commerce agreements. I think you could vote on that even though you're a member of the Chamber. You're an owner of less than 3% of a corporation. AT&T has a franchise agreement with you, and you own stock in AT&T. That'd be fine. Now, what if it's Google, and you're a 2.5% owner of Google? I don't think you'd be there. I think you'd be home. Reimbursement, getting reimbursed for coming to this conference, voting for that would be fine. More examples of what a remote interest. Remember, these are all the safe things that you can do so that you can vote as a counselor. Receiving municipal services on comparable terms. You're voting for a solid waste agreement with the trash hauler, and they pick up your trash. That's fine. Your wife is the superintendent of the local school district. That's perfectly fine, as long as the contract doesn't say, you know, the superintendent gets a bonus if she gets this facility use agreement negotiated with the town. This is one that's used a lot. A member of a class of at least 10 persons. What they're saying is, your interest may be so diluted that it won't be substantial, therefore a conflict. How might it come up? You're a counselor, and a relative of yours is a member of town staff, and you're voting on a budget. As long as that budget applies equally to at least 10 employees, you can vote on that. This one is a new one, and I'm not quite sure why it's there, and I think it creates more harm than good. Your relative is an employee of another entity. Your son works for Cox, and Cox has a license agreement, and and just a low-level employee. Then you can vote. But what if this seems to imply that if there's only 24 employees, it's a conflict? See, I would argue no. I would argue if there's 24 employees, I'd go back to that rule of 10 and say you could vote. I don't think they thought that one through. And here you're voting for a financial advisor. You're voting for a financial advisor to advise you, and you're part of a mutual fund that the financial advisor, that company, Schwab, that wouldn't be a conflict. So now we've described what the conflict is. What do you do? If it's not remote, it's substantial. And if you receive direct or indirect pecuniary or proprietary interest, if you get something because of it, then you must declare a conflict. That isn't absolute. I mean, I can remember the County Board of Supervisors when they were locked in their battle with Mr. Thomas and were trying to decide how to proceed. They decided that they could vote on decisions that had indirect, remote impact on them in the personal litigation, and the court said that wasn't a conflict. So the point being, if you bump into something, there is a protection that says, excuse me, that if it's remote or too speculative, that it won't be a conflict. Then what do? You refrain from participating in any matter, including attempting to influence the decision, and you record the record in the official records of the city. And for the clerk, I think there's a statute out there that says you're supposed to keep a separate schedule of all these conflicts. People ask, if I have a conflict, do I have to step down from the dais? And I don't think city and town attorneys always give the same answer. But you can decide what you want to do. I don't think you have to. But some say body language, frowns, could be communicating views about a conflict. To be ultra safe, you could step down, but I don't think the open meeting law requires you to. Or the conflict of interest law. So we've talked about being open, and we're now talking about acting in the interest of the public. We've talked about the state statutes that deal with conflicts of interest. Now we're going to talk about going to jail. And I can remember I used to give this presentation on land use years and years ago when Ken came from Oregon, and there was a different attorney from the AG's office who gave this kind of presentation. And for those of you, I'm old, who remember in high school when you were getting your driver's ed and they'd show you the film. Back then it was film, not video. And they'd always show the crashed vehicles with blood and beer cans in the car just to try to scare you. Well, this deputy AG, that was all scare. And it was like, run for the doors. I no longer want to be an elected official. And so Ken said to me, can you be a little more positive? And so I don't think the laws, here we're going to talk about the laws that are dangerous if you break the law. But there are ways you can avoid breaking the law so you don't automatically think, like they tried to do when you were a high schooler, that every time you drive you'll get in a collision. No bribes or extortion. See, I'm underscoring the right words. You have to knowingly violate the law. A public servant who knowingly asks or receives any gratuity or reward is guilty of a Class 6 felony. And you can't use your office to try to secure anything of value. Now, you'd think that's pretty easily understood. But those of you who remember ASCAM saw on 60 Minutes some of our elected officials stuffing dollars into briefcases on TV. And it was because of ASCAM. There's some other laws that were drafted we're going to talk about. Bribery. Public servants who solicit and accept any benefit upon an agreement or understanding that it may influence their official conduct is a violation. I remember I went to Catholic school. You got to think, the nuns used to always say, if you think it might be wrong, maybe it might be. And so the point being, if you think it's wrong, don't do it. Extortion. A public servant commits theft by extortion by knowingly obtaining or seeking to obtain property or services by means of a threat. Now, we've actually seen developers, there's a statute in Title IX that says you can grant zoning dependent upon the property owner, the developer, doing certain things by a date certain. And if they don't do it, it'll revert. Allowed by statute. We actually had a claim where they said that was extortion. By taking away their zoning, we were extorting them, and it had to go to the risk pool. I worked with the risk pool, and we had the defendant. It was a quick one. We won. A ban on extra compensation. You may not receive or agree to receive anything more than what little you get as an elected official. You can't go and say, hey, by the way, I'll grant your zoning and hire my daughter. Ban on incompatible employment. This is sort of the revolving door. Both during and 12 months, you can't come back and represent represent something you acted upon when you were acting as a counselor. Entertainment. I talked about ASCAM. Our state laws in Title 40, I think it was 41, were significantly revised because of ASCAM. And it generally attaches not to you as a local, where there's one component that does attach to you that I'll talk about. But it generally focuses on what our legislators do and what our state, primarily our legislators do. But if you read that law, it'll give you some guidance as the kinds of gifts you can. This is all going to be found in your code. Many codes just say categorically you can't do anything, and if that's the case, then it's probably easily followed. But it will be. This is the one aspect of that Title 41 that does apply to you guys. If a compensated lobbyist offers you entertainment or a gift to influence legislation, that would be a violation. So let's assume now that you have a zoning matter before it's coming from planning zoning. And how many here are former planning and zoning commissioners? I know we have one or two, I think. This would apply to you as well. What this says is if you go out with someone who's trying to influence you, you need to find out if they're a compensated lobbyist, because if there's something on the agenda related to that lobbyist's interest, that would be a violation. And it gets back to the nun's advice. Does it make sense? It is not illegal, now that you're on a council, to be able to continue to have friendships with people who are lobbyists. It's not illegal to let lobbyists and to take or private sector interest to take you out to lunch. But let's assume you're going out to lunch, and even if it's an old friend, and that old friend has an agenda item to get a special use permit next night, I probably wouldn't go out to lunch with him, if only for the reason of the appearance of impropriety. But technically, that wouldn't be a violation if he or she, the person taking you out, wasn't a compensated lobbyist. And again, I keep losing the clicker. There it is. Whistleblower. Arizona law prohibits you, public employers, from reacting and taking adverse personnel actions against public employees who claim there are violations of state or city or town law. And I'll bet you most of you don't have, there's a body that if an employee does exercise his or her right to complain of an alleged illegal conduct, there's a body that if you have it set up, they would go to that body. And if you're a large city or town, you may have it. None of the 7 I work for have it, so they go to a state personnel body. But this is meant to protect individuals who think that you may be acting inappropriately. And again, this is that second pillar of the 4 pillars that are meant to guide you. It's to say what we're doing is open, and what we're doing is meant to promote the interests of the community and not our self-interest. Yes, sir.
Question related to that. In order to the employee to have the protection of the whistleblower, doesn't that employee have to actually sign the complaint of what they're doing?
It will depend. I know you don't have this in your code. If the code requires that, yes. I think not. I mean, let's assume they come to the manager and say, I think Department Director X is doing. If I'm the manager, it'd be wise if I'm the manager to write it in writing and have them sign it. But if they don't, it doesn't mean they didn't raise the whistleblower. I mean, it doesn't. You still can't take an adverse action even if they didn't sign. But I would get them to sign, because you're now going to get into a fight as to who said what and when. And so if the manager would ask you what to do, or ask me what to do, I would say, let's get it in writing, because we're now about to start a food fight among town employees, or worse, food fight among town employees and counselors. I'd rather get it in writing so that the story doesn't change. But I don't think it denies the employee the protection of the whistleblower statute. They still can't be adversely acted upon. Yes, ma'am.
Would the whistleblower statute apply to sexual harassment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they have much better arguments there. I mean, if I'm the victim of sex, yeah, yes, it does. But I think they have much better protection under the sexual harassment statutes. But yes, it would apply. But that's a weak. They have our laws, particularly with now the Me Too generation. I think our laws are written so everyone is so aware of that they have much better protection as someone alleging sexual harassment. Now we're in the third. Now we're talking about responsible government. We in our state, and this is how you're in the open, making a decision that is not in your self-interest. This pillar says you need to be responsible when you're spending public money. Neither the state nor any subdivision of the state, that's you, shall make any donation or grant by subsidy or otherwise to any individual or association. This is one of the arguments that was made up in Sedona here. Sedona has up in Sedona on the Chamber of Commerce support. This is a case, it's a little old, but the reason I included it really was a watershed case. For years, and I was guilty. I was guilty in the big law firm helping develop cities now, do all those high rises in downtown Phoenix, arguing that we had all these benefits. It was sort of like counting votes in Chicago, all these benefits of employees, and that would justify all these taxes we were throwing at developers. And people like Atra and people like Goldwater got upset and they sued. And the Court of Appeals agreed with them. And they were saying that this case dealt with sales tax for parking spaces. And the Court of Appeals says completely illegal and threw out everything. And had that case been upheld, it would have thrown out any number of bonds issues that had been made all over the state. Because what we were doing back then is developers would come to you, the mayor usually, and they'd come to the city attorney and say, cut this deal. And then the mayor and the developer would say, oh my God, we can do all this stuff. And then we would wink, wink, nod, nod, and we'd have all these significant employment, and we'd throw money at them. And it never occurred. And so this case, this is a development in between Phoenix and Scottsdale, and the Court of Appeals said no. But the Supreme Court stepped in and said, okay. And they gave pretty good guidance that I think actually helps, that I've used a lot in advising smaller cities and towns. There was a Ford dealership in between, is Cottonwood here? I know Camp Verde's here, in between Cottonwood and Camp Verde, and they were trying to leverage Camp Verde and Cottonwood. I hid behind this one and said, we can't give you that. The Constitution says we can't, let's work through why. Courts will defer to your decision. The voters elected you to guide your community, not judges. And they have a pretty low standard. Don't unquestionably abuse your discretion. I mean, they're saying they're gonna, I think this is good government. They're going to say, as long as you have a reason that you can articulate that supports what you're doing, the court won't second guess you. But this is where they got after guys like me and more really the accountants. You can't count all these indirect jobs and tax benefits. We need to see hard evidence that employment will occur. This has greater impact on larger cities because larger cities have the huge complexes like Scottsdale Fashion Park, the Arizona Mills, Bank One Ballpark, and so well, that's not subject. That's wrong. That's a district that's not subject. But little smaller, like the Ford dealership in Camp Verde, I like the gift clause in this case. The city attorneys in Tempe, in fact, the Phoenix city attorney and I were on a panel. He didn't like this case because it really did impact their ability to do some of their deals. The case specifically says use your procurement rules. It specifically points out it doesn't apply to streets, curbs, and gutters. And my point is the Constitution here can be your friend. And this is where we attorneys can help you. We can be the bad guy. You can say to the developer, we can't do it. The city attorney or town attorney says it would violate the law. We're still in the responsible side of government, where they want you to spend money appropriately. And so there's a wide variety of ways you can procure things. And there's two general bodies of law. There's one body of law when you're building stuff, public works. That's much more rigid. There's another body of law when you're buying stuff. It's generally just in your procurement code. And significantly, you don't have to follow the state procurement code. You can have whatever code you like. The first one is quotes. That's usually for services. And generally, your code will say above and below certain numbers, you can get phone quotes or you just get written quotes. Check in the catalog and you're perfectly fine. These next ones are the ones that deal with when you're building stuff. And in the past, the first one was the worst. I don't know if we have any engineers, but design, bid, build is probably a very inefficient way to spend public money. Why? It's slow. And two, it doesn't allow the architect and the builder to talk. And so the architect designs it, and then you put out the bid, and you have to always go with low bid, and you usually get what you pay for, a low bidder. And so these next three, CM at risk, job order contracting, and design build, all give you the ability to factor in things other than just price so that you can get a better deal. The best one that we use the most is construction manager at risk. That's because the design build is one where the builder and the designer is the same body. And you can do that, but if you do that, you better have somebody on your staff who is close to being an architect herself to monitor what the builder's architect is doing. Phoenix has done it for things like wastewater treatment plants. The problem with design build is the architect doesn't work for you. The CM at risk, the architect does work for you. And the beauty of CM at risk, unlike design build, you can do both simultaneously. You can be designing and get it started, and then you can start building at the same time and have interplay between the two. And then in evaluating which contractor you want, you don't have to go with low bid. Job order contracting, schools use it a lot, and if you're a jurisdiction with a lot of facilities, to do things that are procured for and installed on many facilities like HVACs, you can go and in effect contract with a contractor and have her on the shelf to provide a unit if indeed the HVAC goes out at town hall. Cooperative purchase, you're going to see that a lot. That's where you buy something off another appropriately procured contract, and you have to have a very short agreement with the other body to make sure you can share their procurement. Now this is one, and we have the League's General Counsel here who is monitoring this and monitoring Christina quite well. It's SB 1487. It's a new law, and this is the responsible side of government. This is a consequence of some people thinking you're irresponsible. But it's given huge power to our legislators. They could just dial up the AG, write a letter, and then the AG has 30 days to respond. And depending on what happens, if the AG determines state law was violating, they give you 30 days to cure, and if not cured, state treasurer is going to withhold state shared revenue. That's a horrendous penalty. If determines there may have occurred, they'll submit it to the court, but you have to post a bond, and the bond is huge, greatly limiting your ability to respond. There have been, I think, 10 of these, and generally they've split 50-50, siding with the jurisdiction and siding as being right, and siding with the legislature as being wrong. And it's been so outrageous that legislators will argue this, and it's not even their district. But two come to mind recently where Sedona has really done a great job, a wonderful job. I mean, these are the things that they're talking about, the American Metal and Snowflake, Bisbee, a plastic bag. Tucson lost this one, destruction of firearms. Phoenix, violation of immigration policy. I was on Somerton, we won that one. Tempe, kind of lost. But let's do Sedona's. They lost on the licensing of vacation rentals, and we're still grappling with that. I think there's ways around it. But this one was horrendous. The AG determined that the contracts that I suspect all of you have with your chambers of commerce were illegal because you were following the law that requires you to take bed tax and spend it to promote things like the Chamber of Commerce. And I wish Robert Pickels were here. He's the Sedona City Attorney. He wrote a masterful response and won. So my advice here is, and we're again this third prong of third pillar of responsible government. And when we get to the last part about it being efficient and trying to work together, use this law as a means. If you're a mayor, is to say we got to be careful. If we go too much to extreme, we risk losing state shared revenue. But there may come times when you have to draw the line, like Sedona did, thankfully for all of us, and say we're not going to jeopardize funding the Chamber of Commerce. And I think that we need to take a look at that statute. I think if the legislators continue to, for example, where one legislature, not even in the district, brings a complaint, and because of the rapid pace and because of the cost of posting a bond makes it so difficult to defend, I think we may need to try to find some legislative relief. Now we're into the fourth, and we're going to make this on time. This is the fourth pillar of government. The first was everything's open. The second is what we're doing in the open is in their interest, not yours. The third is it's responsible. We're spending public money responsibly. The fourth one is we're going to do this effectively, efficiently, and trying to avoid excessive liability. We're going to go back to the Founding Fathers. This is Adams again. A simple, perfect democracy had never yet existed. The whole people were incapable of deciding much of anything, even on the small scale of a village. This is his biographer is talking about this. He had had enough experience with town meetings at home to know that in order for anything to be done, certain powers and responsibilities had to be delegated to a moderator, a town clerk, a constable, and at times the special committees. He was talking about the need of a leader to guide his or her community. Jefferson is even more on point. The duty of the chief magistrate is to unite in himself the confidence of the whole people, to produce a union of the powers of the whole and point them in a single direction, as if all constituted but one body and one mind. What Jefferson is saying there, and he's much different than Adams. Jefferson really was someone who was strongly imbued with participatory democracy. Adams was more in the name of federalism. Jefferson really wanted to protect the rights to speak. Let's go back a slide real quick. This really falls to the mayor. The mayor is the chief executive officer. She or he, this is how they run your community. They have awesome responsibilities with not a lot of power. But the power is strong in terms of how they set the agenda, how they guide the discussion, how they use that SB 1487 to try to force compromise. What Adams and Jefferson are saying is, whatever you do, let's reach out and try to bind the community together. One way, in working with your county, and almost all of you have the council manager form of government, it's where the mayor and council provide guidance and direction, with the mayor taking the lead and the manager and staff implementing. It's based on the model of the CEO with the board of directors, and the city manager is somewhat like the chief operating officer appointed by the mayor or council. The city manager, though, serves at the pleasure of the council and can be terminated for any reason and without cause. I can remember when I first was the town attorney up in Camp Verde, they had their manager, I'm from Yuma and he was from Yuma, and I can remember his son was an Eagle Scout. He would wear these Eagle Scout cufflinks. He was so proud to have been the manager. And there was a change of elected leadership at Camp Verde, and he was and it crushed him that he was terminated. I don't know how many managers we have here, but he called a manager and says, "Oh, you'll get used to it. It happens all the times. The shelf life of a manager is but a few years, but they do serve at the pleasure." And they will have an employment contract, and they'll usually have a severance agreement, because to get a good manager who knows that she can be fired instantly, they need severance. The manager oversees the entire municipal operations, all departments, the hiring of staff, the budget, and implementing your goals. And this gets now to what is your rights. The council member may make inquiries of staff. That's almost in every code, and this comes out of one code. This is what you'll find in most codes. This is your right as an elected official. Except as otherwise provided in this charter, neither the mayor nor any council member shall interfere with the execution of the city manager of the power by the manager of the powers and duties or order, directly or indirectly, the appointment by the city manager of any person to an office or employment or removal therefrom. Except for the purposes of inquiry, the mayor and council shall deal with the administrative services under the manager solely through the city manager, and neither the mayor nor the council members shall give orders to any subordinate, either publicly or privately. Now, this is one I can't believe I won't get questions about. Yes, sir.
And Bill, can you talk about whether a council member gets across that legislative immunity line?
Paul, with my client, Paul just asked a good question. This slide. But now this is one we should have some conversations. I can't tell you how many times Ken and sometimes me have to parachute into a jurisdiction to explain that paragraph we just talked about. Because there is tension here. The voters elected you, and you're pissed off that the manager may be doing something. And you always are, and you want to exercise control. And it happens a lot. And so what we do is that last slide, not this slide, the last slide, we throw up too, but then we get to this slide, what Paul just asked. You as elected officials, under Title 12 of the state statutes, have absolute immunity when you act legislatively. But the minute you start siding with an employee, the minute you start giving an employee an argument that you were involved in her firing, you are personally liable. Now, the pool will pay for that. We'll defend you. But why deny the town the defense of the legislative immunity? That's why you use the manager and you use the HR director. Secondly, accountability. Right? If you go around the manager and she can say to you that I wasn't involved, you did that, it's very difficult to hold the manager accountable. I was active duty in Reserve Air Force for 27 years. The one benefit, and the military is not the most democratic of institutions, but it's a really efficient institution. And why? They have accountability. They put somebody in charge and they hold him or her responsible. The minute you as elected officials go around the manager and start directing someone beneath the manager says, when you try to fire him, that you can't because you violated the contract and the code. Your code will say what I just said. And that will be a misdemeanor if you violate the code. But in a minute, I don't, because I started this by saying, we're all here to support you. And so I don't want to now say, by the way, you have to sit mum at the dais and do nothing. We'll talk about that in a second. It completely confuses staff if they have you standing at their desk and asking for something. But that doesn't mean you don't have the right to ask for information. It does mean you can't say to the staff, I want you to give this developer the special use permit. And finally, it gives you deniability. I can remember after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was quoted as saying, success has a lot of parents, orphan, and disaster is just an orphan. And that's not the right quote, I forget what it was, but you got the gist of it. The point being, if something goes bad, you can blame him or me. If it goes good, you can take the credit. Now, how does this work, though? Let's see, maybe it's the next slide. Let me look. No. What this means is, it means you have to have a very good relationship with your manager. And you need to, because that's who you hold accountable. If truly you don't like what's something happening, you can privately or even publicly say to the manager, because he or she does work for you, and say, I'm offended by what is happening in this department. If it doesn't change, we will fire you for cause and you'll lose that severance. So I do think you have some role there. But for all those other reasons that we talked about, all these reasons, it's wise to let the manager put herself up front and you give the guidance. But the law, our first slide, I said, our participatory form of democracy relies on the folks who were elected, and that's you. You set the standards. You set the goals. You set the vision. You set the rules. And you can fire the town attorney, you can fire the manager. And for those who hire the clerk, you can fire the clerk. But then let them do their jobs for all the reasons we just described. we're still on the sufficient avoiding liability pillar of government. And we're going to talk about land use claims, because this is the most difficult. This is probably one of the most difficult jobs you're going to have as elected officials, as you balance the need of the police power versus the private property rights. This all came from way back in 1215, the Magna Carta. There, the property owners were saying to the king, we're kind of mad that you're spending our tax money in France fighting these wars. And that's when the Magna Carta was written. That was the beginning of the Due Process Clause of our Constitution. You are charged with enforcing the Due Process Clause. And we're going to talk about what that means. That is balancing these two powers. But the biggest problem is, in land use, is that the folks who are coming to you reside on one planet and you're on another. I actually went to this session. Land use is something that has caused significant liability statewide. And the risk pool, we have 77 cities and towns in the risk pool. I'm the general counsel. And we're one of the few insurance companies in America that provides insurance coverage for land use, because it's so dangerous. Back many years ago, we really were getting our bell rung when the market turned back then, and all sorts of lawsuits. When the market turns, the developers decide to sue you for the reasons on this slide that we'll talk about. And our reinsurer said, we're going to pull the coverage. And we went out to our members and said, don't. The members said, don't. And so they sent me out with someone from the risk pool to have a presentation as to why, and some of the slides you're going to see here in a minute, why we have to mind our P's and Q's in land use, because the dangers are paramount. But the reason they're paramount is that you come from different planets. I went to this session. This was a session put on by the private sector for private sector developers, lawyers. They were all there. They were there in their Mercedes and Audis and all the rest. I now drive a Prius. Back then it was a Ford Escort. And so I pulled in, and this was one of the slides. This is why you got to be careful when the developer comes to you, or more likely their lobbyist. The process for adopting or amending the general plan of a municipality or county is more comprehensive than the zoning process in terms of involvement of the community. Thus, there are more opportunities for the land use lawyer to create a favorable record on which to base future litigation. This is so complex, the land use lawyers were telling their colleagues, that make sure you can sue them. I was sitting there, I felt like I was it was like watching the chief come back from a battle with Aho and throw Aho on the fire and let all the little Indians gobble up Aho. I mean, that's exactly what they were saying, is that but you are innocent, generally. You are saying, I want what's best for my community, but just know that the developer may not have the same view. Land use claims, they present any number of possible claims. Constitutional rights, breach of contract, tortious interference, misrepresentation, extortion, the one I talked about earlier. Equitable estoppel, that's where if your poor clerk does something wrong and they rely on it, you're going to see zingers back saying, I just relied on this. Whenever you get a letter from someone saying, I relied on this, get it to your lawyer. And then breach of fiduciary duty. These are all the kinds of things you see in land use claims. But this is the biggie. This is the Magna Carta as it appears in America. No person, state and federal constitution, shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. You have to give notice, and there has to be substantive and procedural due process, and you have to treat everybody almost the same. There's a jurisdiction in the hall. We are dealing with this process right now. This is the hardest thing to do. We have we have someone who claims rights under a federal act that protects a disadvantaged class of people, and they want to set up a group home in a community. Think of what happens. And our Constitution says you have to acknowledge these rights. Our Constitution says you have to have hearings. Our Constitution says you have to acknowledge the rights of both parties. The neighbor says, I don't want the group home. The person who's using the group home says we have duties to the disabled. This is very difficult. They're entitled to a hearing. As long as what you're doing promotes health, safety, morals, and welfare, which is very broad, you can do it. It must bear a reasonable relationship. Remember back a minute ago, or about 20 minutes ago, when I was saying how the courts are here, the laws are here to support you? All you have to do is be able to say, I have evidence that gives me a rational basis to reach my conclusion. What I'm deciding is fairly debatable. And this is a case right out of Marana that is quoted nationwide, as long as what you're doing doesn't shock the conscience, it'll be okay. But I can tell you, we've shocked a few consciences, and that's the standard. The courts will default to you. When someone comes to you with a decision, get your economic development director, get your manager, get your city or town attorney to give you the information so that you can explain why. I can remember about 15 years ago when I was giving this talk, I was in courtside, and I was talking about the rational basis test, and I said, it's sort of like the standard is what you'd explain to your spouse. And this guy, no, that's not the standard. And it's a much tougher standard with my spouse. And so, but the point being, as long as you can explain it and have facts to justify it, a lady in a robe sitting down there in court won't second guess you. Here's the problem. There's a federal statute, because it's a protected constitutional right. As long as they can find some damage, let's assume there's a variance to carve 6 inches off of a sidewalk, and you decide not to do it, even though you just did it next door, or you didn't have the notice in the hearing, you violated due process. They now have a constitutional claim. Even if the 6 inches is only $20 a damage, they get all their attorney's fees. The worst thing you can do when you're negotiating with an adverse party is have the other party's lawyers in charge. And so we've had this at the pool. We've had claims when it wasn't the damages. We were now having to pay their lawyers millions of dollars. That's why we have to be careful with constitutional claims, because this statute, Section 1983, lets them get all their attorney's fees. Again, we're talking about ways to avoid liability and to create opportunity for your government development agreements. Years ago, there was what's called the building permit rule. Well, here's the rule. I think this is good law. If I have a piece of property and the code says I can have a gas station on my property, and I start digging a hole for the tank, you shouldn't be able to change the zoning code to deny me my gas station. That's called the building permit rule. And the minute you start building, you vested your right to finish your gas station. But the problem becomes much more difficult when the development is massive, like Bank One, like America West, we did that one in the 80s, like Arizona Mills. Now you have the developer, before you can get a building permit, you've got to spend tens of millions of dollars on architects. So that's why the law was written in 1986 to allow you to give a development agreement, which is in effect contractually giving them the building permit rule and saying, we will vest your right to build your stadium, we'll vest your right to build your Scottsdale Fashion Park, and you don't have to build yet. But the minute you do that, the minute you give them their zoning, you have created substantial value. What you've just done is you've entitled their land. And so that's why you're going to have your town attorneys telling you, we want to make sure there's restrictions on transfer. Because what you just did is create value. And you want that value to stay in your community and not have someone sell the entitled land, take the upside, and move out of town. So the point being here, you can vest the rights, know you're creating value, but get something back. Again, part of my views is trying to avoid extremes. And although I am a lawyer, I'm not sure litigators always are the best way to solve problems. Dispute resolution is the best. It can be a better way to solve problems. It's sort of like marriage counseling versus divorce court. What it does is it gives everybody their day in court. Litigation is there will be a winner and there will be a loser. It tries to solve problems. It doesn't leave the lawyers in charge like litigation does. For those of you, I know I have a few lawyers here, who have been in litigation, your lawyer tells you when to show up at the interrogatories and show up at the depositions. And I wish sometimes I were a litigator, because they get the judge, they have schedules that are always imposed by the court, and they say, oh, we have a conflict. City and town attorneys don't have that. When the mayor calls, you hop to. It avoids large recoveries of attorney's fees, and most importantly, it puts you in charge and not the lawyers. That's why we think this is the wise approach. And I work with the risk pool. If you're in the risk pool, you have to include mediation in your development agreements. That's what this says. We require you to at least try. We require you to mediate your disputes before you end up jumping into court. Yes, sir.
And the nice advantage of mediation is if you don't like the deal, you can walk away.
Yeah.
You haven't hurt yourself.
Yep, it is. For all the reasons I just said, once you get the litigation, the lawyers are in charge, and the fees just go out the roof. And then all of a sudden it becomes self-perpetuating. We're going to make it on time. Here, sadly, we're going to finish with Yarnell. But this was truly an eye-opener. Here, this was the paper the next day. New Yarnell records depict non-stop chaos. 19 souls were lost. Do we have any of the risk pool board members here? I don't know if we do. We don't. This was an eye-opener statewide. When this event occurred, there were airborne fuel-retardant airplanes who didn't know where they should drop. They weren't on the same radio frequency. There were agencies not talking to the others. In fact, Prescott had their town attorney is a fellow reservist like me, Army though, and he called me. They came into the pool in June. Normally you come into the pool July 1. They asked to come into the pool June. The fire was the end of June. When the fire occurred, I called John and I go, we got to get the indemnity and see what it says. Because if it didn't have one sentence, the risk pool would have gone under financially for lack of one sentence. And had they not posted a sign at the water cooler, and we'll talk about that, the risk pool would have gone under financially. And so the risk pool board said, we're going to learn from this experience. And so they did an audit. They went to all the members and said, send us your IGAs so we can look at them. And we did. And we were shocked. You call them a number of things. But as problems in a community become more regional than local, you see all these things where you work with your sister neighbors. In the Verde Valley, I know you guys have it all over the Verde Valley, because I'm the Camp Verde town attorney, the Jerome town attorney. There's any number of things where problems cross jurisdictional boundaries. And so you have all these agreements. And if you don't have the right sentence, you could have had the same problem that thankfully Prescott didn't have, but it was more by luck than intention. But I'll bet you all have some of these, and we've looked at some of their agreements. First, there's a huge imbalance of negotiations. ADOT and forestry are examples. ADOT Tucson's here, they have like at this time they had 2 employees. They wanted to build 2 roundabouts, all paid for by ADOT for ADOT holding federal funds hostage. And ADOT wanted Tucson to indemnify ADOT and its contractors for all of their negligence. And they did this to all of you. They were saying, if you want federal funds, you indemnify us. Pure extortion. This is where the league, and Christina wrote one hell of a memo that went to ADOT's director. And Ken and Christina went there and we solved it. We shamed them. Again, I use the old the one benefit of being Catholic is Catholic shame. Shame them out of guilt. And so we said, how can you do this? And they budged. And this was all a result, there's some benefit of those 19 souls being lost, is that we looked at these IGAs and we said, this is outrageous. I mean, here's some examples. We had Department of Motor Vehicles going to one jurisdiction and saying, if you take responsibility for all of I-10 east or west of Wilcox, responsibility, and indemnify DMS, they got 8 bullet vests for that. 8. And they accepted all the liability. Why? I don't know if we have any former fire chiefs or police chiefs here. Those are the kinds of men and women who will sign anything if they get a bullet, or they get a car or a vehicle. And you've just got to be careful. You've got to make sure these IGAs are careful and don't accept all that liability. And so what we did was we got both state forestry and ADOT to agree on forestry. This was a classic example. This was the problem with Yarnell. All of you have fire chiefs who want their firemen or fire personnel to make money deploying to these wildland fires. They get paid well. And so, but they were signing these documents that almost was the case in Yarnell, where you are indemnifying state forestry. That's what the document said. The document said, if you send one of your guys or gals, you indemnify us. So learning from what Christina helped us do at ADOT, we did the same thing with forestry, and we got all the IGAs changed. IGAs are the document you need to look at. When I give this talk to the city and town attorneys, indemnities are usually at the back end of the agreement. Nobody wants to read them, and there's where you get trapped. And as I said earlier, had that IGA not included one sentence, the risk pool would have gone under. Don't stumble into that liability. Agree on the risk sharing up front, and make sure and learn from the successes we've had both at ADOT and at State Forestry to get them to not make you indemnify them. And the manager from Tucson's here, that was the example we used. How can a town with 2 employees have to indemnify ADOT when ADOT gave us federal funds if ADOT's contractor's negligence? And that's the letter that Christina wrote, and they backed off. We have a new program. Again, we're at the 4th pillar of government. Our efficient pillar of government is the use of law, in what's called the Law Enforcement Assistance Project. This all arose out of, again, we were talking about these multi-agency task force. Well, whenever you respond, a SWAT team responds, the one thing about law enforcement personnel, and correctly so, they don't economize the use of bullets when they're under fire. But we had an event in Pima County. It involved 3 risk pool members in the county, all responding to an event, and the individual was shot, but horrendous. I mean, but we had 4 agencies. Sadly, we hadn't done the IGA review yet. Each of the agencies had an independent indemnity, so that the 3 cities and the county all had to indemnify each other, all with their own attorneys. So here we had admitted liability, liability in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we had 4 lawyers arguing how that $100,000 was going to be allocated. We spent $780,000 with the 4 lawyers to allocate the $100,000. How stupid is that? And so what we've got in this new program is with the consent that you have to consent, and I think Brett Wallace is here from Casa Grande. We've talked about this. They've been a party to one of these. You have the right to say no. But what we're saying to you is, let's use 1 lawyer to represent everybody during the course of litigation, so that we don't have the 4 lawyers chewing up the bills. But then once we have the damages, we'll then mediate with different lawyers how it can be allocated. We think it works, and we think it works well. But these are the kinds of things, that's when we have a lawsuit. We're now learning at the risk pool, we have a personnel assistance program where you can call lawyers for free and get advice. We have a land use assistance program. Some of the slides you've seen today where you can call me and get free advice. And we're now doing the same thing with law enforcement. Lessons learned, and we're done, and we're going to finish on time. Try not to shock the conscience. Avoid over my dead body. This is actually a war story. I was giving a talk in a jurisdiction. And I always would say, because why? If you say, I'm not going to do this over my dead body, remember I told you about the Magna Carta and the due process laws? If you're a body making a decision, and you've announced publicly you're not going to do anything over my dead body, have you given the property owner the rights? You haven't even heard the evidence? So I said that, and I said, the worst thing you can do is announce, I won't do something over my dead body. Dead silence. In the paper that morning, the mayor had said he wasn't going to do something over his dead body. The city attorney came up and told me, and I apologized. I mean, I said, Mayor, just when I said earlier we were talking about council manager form of government, and I didn't mean to be abandoning you elected officials. And I said to the mayor, Mr. Mayor, you have every right to say that. I can't deny you. But I can tell you, you make it far more difficult for us to defend you if there's a lawsuit. Get data to support your views. Get on the same planet. The developers are on Mars, you're on Venus. Let's try to get together. We think mediation is much better, for marriage counseling is much better than divorce court. You are the closest level of government to the electeds. You have the power to take property. You're immediately accountable. That quote from John Adams talking about the terror of, remember, he wasn't Jefferson. Jefferson wouldn't mind the terror. Adams didn't necessarily like it, being a Federalist. Open meeting law and recall, you're instantly accountable. That's why I think you're nonpartisan. And here, unlike at the federal government, inaction is not an option. You have to keep the streets working. You have to make sure the water that comes out of the tap isn't brown. You have to make sure that, for those of you in dark skies, have dark skies. You don't have the luxury of doing what they do in Washington. So we'll finish up where we started. We'll finish up by quoting from the 2 books that I really do suggest you read. You stand on very broad shoulders. There's Jefferson. All will bear in mind this sacred principle that through the will of the majority, though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable. that the minority possesses their equal rights with equal law must protect. And to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection, without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary. And here's Jefferson again. The whole art of government consists in the art of being honest. Only aim to do your duty, and mankind will give you credit. I'm talking now to the mayor. I'm talking now to those at council when you have a meeting. No longer persevere in sacrificing the rights of one part of the empire to the inordinate desires of another, but deal out to all equal and impartial right. This is the important post in which fortune has placed you, holding the balance of a great, well-poised empire. Again, Jefferson. This is out of the Declarations of Independence. Our truths are self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed with these inalienable rights, liberty, pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The four pillars we've been talking about, open, unbiased, responsible, and efficient, all are how you respond to the governed. But this is a new slide. We do stand on broad shoulders. When Senator, I'll get teary-eyed, I really like this guy. This is what he wrote with his biography. Before I leave, I'd like to see our politics begin to return to the purposes and practices that distinguish our history from the history of other nations. I'd like to see us recover our sense that we are more alike than different. We're citizens of a republic made of shared ideals, forged in a new world, to replace the tribal enmities that tormented the old one. Even in times of political turmoil such as these, we share that awesome heritage and the responsibility to embrace it. That's what we've been talking about. That's what we've been talking about since we first started. You carry the baton of Jefferson and Adams and of Senator McCain. Whether we think each other right or wrong in our views on the issues of the day, we owe each other our respect, as so long as our character merits respect. And as long as we share for all of our differences, for all the rancorous debates that enliven and sometimes demean our politics, a mutual devotion to the ideals our nation was conceived to uphold, Jefferson, Adams, that all are created equal, and liberty and equal justice are the natural rights of all. I want to urge Americans, for as long as I can, to remember that this shared devotion to human rights is our truest heritage and our most important loyalty. Sorry, I got emotional. This is important stuff. You are important. What you do is important. You are carrying on the dream of our founding fathers. And we have to hope, because I really think you are our last best hope as to how we can make our participatory democracy work. And I thank you for putting up with me for an hour and a half. Any questions, come on up, we'll talk.
Well, another round of applause for Bill Sims. That was a lot of information. Makes me glad we have one of the best town attorneys in the state of Arizona sitting right here in the office, too. Your next concurrent sessions start at 10 o'clock. Again, there are papers in the back about all of the things you just heard about. And if you have questions for Bill, come on up.
Yeah, come on up, we'll ask. Thank you, sir.